Hi, NT Survey class. This is Professor Henson. We're talking about the Gospel of Mark now. And my computer's acting up. Okay, the Gospel of Mark. Bouncing off of what we talked about in the last part of the lecture with the notion of the two-document hypothesis source, where Mark and Q were used as a source for Matthew and Luke. Of course, Matthew and Luke add in their own materials. Most scholars date Mark as being early, and part of that does play into internal notions in the text. One of the key places is Mark chapter 13. It's possible that Mark is from the perspective of looking back at the destruction, but it's more possible that the gospel writer is looking for the possible coming destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem during the Jewish revolt. It's pretty. A lot of people side on this as part of the equation, where Mark is early because of that, and most of the dating of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, usually kind of the date that kind of the event they date those things around is the temple destruction. Does it appear as though the gospel knows, or the gospel writer knows of this destruction, or they not know about it? And in the opinion of most scholars, again, it's opinion, that Mark was written before the destruction, so probably written before 70 AD. Now, as far as the author goes, there's no signature on the document. All the Gospels, for the most part, didn't have any names on them. Names are added later, attributed to these people later. Now, Papias, a church bishop in Hierapolis, later in the Christian era, especially 129, 130 AD, wrote interpretations of the Lord's sayings. He supposedly said that Mark, this Mark figure, became an interpreter of Peter and wrote accurately, though not in order, many of the things said and done by the Lord as he had noted. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterwards, as I said, this is again Papias talking, as I said, he followed Peter, who composed his teachings in anecdotes and not as a complete work of the Lord's sayings. So Mark made no mistake in writing some of the things just as he had noted them. For he was careful of this one thing, to leave nothing he had heard out, and to say nothing falsely. That's the end of the quote. That's where Papias, this bishop, was quoted by Eusebius, a church historian. Papias, and some believe that it is John Mark of Acts chapter 12, verse 12, who was a companion of both Paul and Peter. He's mentioned in Acts 13:5 as being Paul's companion, and 1 Peter 5:13 as being Peter's companion. The problem with Mark is that Mark was a common name in the Hellenistic age among both the Greeks, Marcos, or in Latin, Marcus. Some propose that the gospel writer may even be the naked man from Mark chapter 14, verses 51 through 52. There's a naked man running around in the garden. Some theorize it's him, but we don't know. There's a little bit of evidence to say, there's church tradition to say it is Mark, the disciple, John Mark, who was again a follower, or at least a friend or co-companion of Paul or Peter. What do we know about the audience of Mark? Well, what do we know about the author writer, or excuse me, the gospel writer, the audience, the implied narrator, whatever? We know that there's some mix-ups in geography. This is the first thing. The gospel writer presents geographical mix-ups. In chapter 7, verse 31, Sidon is assumed to be south of Tyre, and the Sea of Galilee is in the midst of Decapolis. A second thing is there's use of Latin isms. Greek words taken over from Latin, like centurion, legion, denarius. But Latin isms can also be found in Hebrew Talmud, so that's not necessarily a huge thing. Also, we find in Mark 12:42, there's a mention of a widow's mite, a lepton, a coin, a lepton. This is explained with the Latin word quadrata, or the Greek quadrates. Excuse me. And it also mentions of things like a courtyard. It has a Latin explanation. So it's almost as though the person who composed the document, or at least orally dictated to a writer, is trying to explain to an audience ideas and concepts but explain it in a way that somebody in Rome or somebody in the Latin-speaking part of the Roman Empire would understand. You see, the Roman Empire in the time of Jesus and Paul, half of the empire mainly spoke Latin, or read Latin, mostly spoke. And the other half, the eastern half, over where Palestine is, Greece, Alexandria, that was mainly a Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire. So it's as though the writer is writing to a part from the western part, an area of the western part of the empire. A third thing to think about, and as far as what we can tell from the text about the author or the audience, is that the author translates and explains Aramaic phrases. Chapter 5, verse 41, we have Talia Kum. It's explained. There's a 734 has a phrase that's explained. In 1534, we have Elio Elio lama sabachthani, which is explained. And a fourth thing we find is that the writer explains Jewish customs. So more than likely, the gospel writer is writing to a non-Jewish audience, probably not from Palestine. They probably knew Latin. They may have spoke or written in Greek, but they may have known a few Jewish customs. But I mean, it's as though this author is writing for somebody outside of Palestine. In other words, some possible reasons why the letter is written, and Paul Achtermeyer talks about this. This may be to counter the idea of Jesus was a magician. The gospel writer is setting this stuff down in writing, maybe to counteract people, because I mean there were magicians in the ancient world who would go along with exorcisms and healings, and some may have characterized Jesus as like one of these traveling snake oil salesmen, I guess you could say, especially in the Hellenistic settings. Another possible occasion is the counter idea that Jesus was a philosopher. And a lot, again, of Roman philosophers traveled through the Hellenistic world imparting wisdom in public or in private for fees or offerings. And maybe the gospel was written to kind of counter that. Another reason maybe is that the writing was written for a suffering audience. It was intended for audience that may have been suffering persecutions. And there's possibly a hint of that in chapter 8, verses 34 through 37. But we do find some instances, some literary patterns that we do need to take note of. One of them is a story called intercalation. Intercalation is often, at least in Mark, is often referred to as a Markan sandwich, where two stories linked, and one helps the interpreter talk about the other. And if you find one example over in Mark chapter 5, we begin with a story of this leader of the synagogue named Jairus, and he comes to Jesus about his daughter who's point of death. Come, lay your hands on her. Well, all of a sudden that story stops as Jesus went on with him. A large crowd, this is verse 24, pressed in on him. Verse 25 is it picks up a different story, an interruption, if you will, a break in a story. Whereas the story of Jairus is maybe the top part of the bun we see in verses 21 through 24. The stuff inside under the top, under the crown, maybe inside the bun, meat or whatever, is what we find 25 and through 34. And you see this woman who's had this bleeding issue for 12 years. Well, she gone to many physicians, she heard about Jesus, but if I can touch his clothes, I'll be made well. Verse 28. Immediately her hemorrhaging stopped, and Jesus is where the power is gone from. He says, who touched my clothes? Who touched me? Who touched me? And the disciples, verse 31, they kind of look at him and say, people are pressing in on you. What do you mean, who touched me? And he ends up coming to this woman, and verse 34 is, "To daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed." But we find that the story picks up back with Jairus' daughter in verse 35. She's dead. Why trouble go any further? Jesus raises Jairus' daughter. But that middle part of the faith of that woman gives more meaning to the story of Jairus' daughter. Those stories help interpret each other, help give each other meaning. They're separate but not separate. So that's one of the things you find in the intercalations. And there's another intercalation in the cursing of the fig tree. In chapter 11, the cleansing of the temple there, the cursing of the fig tree. And then there's a story over in chapter 3 with the disbelief by the scribes. And it's inserted into a story of a family's disbelief. So that's chapter 3, verse 21 through 35. You find those two stories linked together. And these intercalations, these Markan sandwiches, are very much a characteristic we find in the Gospel of Mark. So it's a literary device that's very marking in this sense, at least as far as the Gospels are concerned. Now you'll notice on the right side of the screen we have the NIV application commentary up. One of the neat things you'll find when you look at, and this is written by David Garland, one of the things when you start looking at commentaries, or even like a Bible commentary like the Holman Concise Bible Commentary, or even a Bible dictionary, they usually give you an outline, at least the scholars' thematic outline they perceive the document in being, because we don't, they've kind of sat down with the text and they've worked with it. The commentaries usually in the first part of the commentary near the introduction. The concise Bible commentaries are a little more condensed, so that, and then even the Bible dictionaries will have it like an article, like Gospel of Mark, and usually give an outline. I would recommend something like the Anchor Bible Dictionary or the New Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, which is kind of newer. In fact, some of my former professors have contributed to that series. But notice these scholars sit down and kind of map out the flow of the text. And we find the different aspects of Jesus' ministry is kind of talked about in the outline. And we find that there is a bit of a prologue in the beginning part of the Gospel of Mark, and it kind of sets out a few things. In fact, one of those things we find in chapter 1, David Garland, his NIV application commentary, says the title of the gospel, the beginning of the good news about Christ, about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In fact, one almost sets itself up like a title. Verse 1, if you'll notice on the right side of the screen in the ESV, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Excuse me. So this is what the author is going to be talking about, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and kind of explain what it means to be the Son of God. Now, as far as Christology goes, Christology is kind of like their view of Christ. Mark has not as a developed Christology as maybe Matthew or Luke, but even less so than the Gospel of John. John has a very high and developed Christology. We find more of the emphasis on the humanity of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. But we notice this, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, we find a few other passages going on. We find in chapter 1, there's the temptation of Jesus, but over in verse 21, if my technology will work with me here. My computer is slow as molasses sometimes. Yeah, 121, we find this silencing of the demons. One thing to note in the Gospel of Mark is there seems to be this notion of a messianic secret. Jesus doesn't want other people to tell him, doesn't want people to tell other people who he really is. There's a few things going on with this. Jesus silences demons and he silences disciples. There's a few broken silences because of it. But notice in verses 1 through 28 and also in chapter 3, verses 9 through 11, the demons know, but the disciples don't seem to. We find the disciples seem to be a little lost for the most part. But they went to Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, this is verse 21 here, chapter 1, he entered into the synagogue and was teaching, and they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. And anyone was in their synagogue, and a man with an unclean spirit, demon-possessed, possibly, at least according to most of the text. And he cried out, what have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. I know who you are. The demons know who he is. Jesus rebuked them, saying, be silent, come out of him. And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed, so they questioned among themselves, what is this? A new teaching and authority. He commands even unclean spirits, and they obey him. And at once his fame spread throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. So again, there's this notion of the disciples don't get it, but the demons do. And that happens in a few passages. And we're going to go over to another passage here, look at where Jesus silences the disciples. Matthew 8:27, as well as chapter 9, verse 9, Jesus kind of tells the disciples, hey, don't say much, don't say much. Excuse me. Jesus went with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, And on his way, he asked his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others says Elijah, and others, one of the prophets." And they asked him, but he asked them, "But who do you say I am?" And Peter, Simon Peter, answered him, "You are the Christ." And he was strictly charged to tell no one about him. So Peter says, "You are the Christ." Well, what does that Christ mean? Well, there may have been some misconception here. Jesus silences Peter, but he goes on, verse 31. He began teaching about the Son of Man, which, by the way, the preferred terminology that Jesus uses for himself in the Gospel of Mark is Son of Man. Some of the translations, such as the Common English Bible, CEB, translate that as Human One, and that may echo back to Ezekiel, maybe echoes back a little bit to Daniel, some passages of Daniel, this notion of Son of Man, probably more so than Ezekiel, but Human One, emphasizing humanity of Jesus in some ways. But anyway, that Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So this man who seemingly gets it, says, "You're the Christ," comes back and says, whoa, Jesus, what are you talking about? Suffer or die. But verse 33, but turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan." Yeah, I encourage y'all to look that one up. That's interesting. "But you are not setting your mind on things of God, but on the things of man." So this is a rebuke of the disciples who don't get it. Again, disciples don't get it. It's almost like they're the Keystone Cops, bumbling around, bubbling idiots in the gospel in some ways. They don't realize who Jesus is, even though he's with them and they're traveling with him. But the demons get it, right? The ones that probably shouldn't get it, get it. So you have the disciples who are silenced. You have the demons who are silenced. You have a few places where the silence is broken. And one example is over in Mark chapter 40, or chapter 1, verse 40 through 45. This leper came to Jesus, "You'll make me clean." Just in verse 43, and Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer your cleansing, what Moses commanded, for proof." Verse 45, but he went out and began to talk freely about it, to spread news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town. It was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. So, there's a silence is broken. Now let's get back to the disciples just for a minute. Now, it's not just that the demons get it and the disciples fail to get it, but also the Gentiles seem to get it more so in the Gospel of Mark than the disciples do. There are at least 5 ways the disciples fail. One example is over in Mark chapter 4, verse 14 and 13, chapter 4, verse 13, chapter 4, verse 34, chapter 7, verse 18. They fail to understand Jesus' teaching in parables. Over in Mark chapter 10, verses 10 through 12, they fail to understand Jesus' teaching on divorce. A third thing they fail to understand is they fail to understand Jesus' teaching about his impending death. Chapter 8, verse 32 through 33. And also what we find over in chapter 9, verse 9 through 13. And chapter 9, verse 32. Another thing they fail to understand is when Jesus calms the sea over in Mark chapter 4. Get my technology to work here. Chapter 4, verse 35. So they're trying to go across the other side. A great windstorm comes up. Jesus he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. They woke him up. Says, "Teacher, why do you not care that we're dying out here on this lake?" Sea Galilee is more the lake than it is the actual sea. He woke up and rebuked the wind and said, "Peace, be still." If I saw somebody stop a storm with just their words, I would be like, "This dude ain't from around here." But he said to them, verse 40, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him." Well, he's the Son of God. They don't get it. They're idiots. hermeneutically. Now remember, hermeneutics or hermeneutically, notion of interpretation, taking a text and apply it to one's own life today. Hermeneutically, these disciples as being ones who don't get it. Which, by the way, the fifth thing they fail to understand Jesus walking on water over in chapter 6. Let's kind of look at that, and we'll talk about this hermeneutics thing here a little bit. Get my technology working here. My little computer is working hard here today. So over in chapter 6, verse 45, Jesus is walking on water. Verse 49, skip down there. When they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." He got in the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astonished, for they did not understand about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. The previous story that was mentioned there. So these disciples, bless their hearts, good southern phrase there, bless their hearts, they're idiots. They don't get it. They don't get it. Now, hermeneutically, that'll preach. These disciples who fail, even though Jesus is right in front of them, they fail to realize who he is. A lot of Christians do that today. We fail to realize who God is and how powerful God is, even though he may be working all around us. We fail to see God working. We fail to realize how big God is, despite all the many things he's blessed us with. But, that's a sermon unto itself, and y'all didn't pay this class to hear me preach, but there you go. One thing to talk about the Gospel of Mark is this notion of eschatology. Now, eschatology is a big fancy word, study of end things. Eschaton means end or last. Ology, study of. And we find some passages in Mark where there is a notion of this eschatology where may point to the destruction of the temple. And some have interpreted it being the end of days. But it's mentioned that word eschatology too, because it'll pop back up. Chapter 13 of Mark is one of those key passages for eschatology. And let me get to the New Revised Standard Version if it'll work here. Let's see here. Get my technologically working. I'm a high-tech redneck. Okie doke. So Mark chapter 13, we find some of this notion of the destruction temple. And this is kind of this eschatology we talked about there. The destruction temple foretold, persecution foretold. That passage kind of ties in very much so with this notion of end things, last things. We'll talk about it more so when we get to other passages. There's some in Paul. There's some good eschatological passages in other parts of the Gospels. Revelation, we'll talk about eschatology a great deal. So let's see here. A little slow today. There we go. Not enough coffee today. Here we go. So notice here at chapter 16 of Mark, there is, my notes in the NRSV show a shorter ending of Mark and a longer ending of Mark. Some of the earliest manuscripts that we have are missing that longer ending of Mark. Some of the oldest, older, more reliable manuscripts are missing it. But let's kind of look at this 16 and see where we stop here. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome both brought spices so they might go and anoint him. And very early the first day of the week, when the sun was risen, they went to the tomb, and they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. They entered the tomb, and they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. There is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples, Peter, that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing, for they were afraid. Okay, so notice a little footnote right there. Get to work. Says some of the ancient authorities bring the book to a close at the end of verse 8. One authority concludes the book with a shorter ending. Others include the shorter ending with some, and then continue to verses 9 through 20. In most authorities, verses 9 through 20 follow immediately after verse 8. Though some of the authorities, the passage is marked as being doubtful. So more than likely, based off these ancient manuscripts, some of this other stuff was added on. Okay. Now notice, if you leave it just that one ending right before the shorter ending, they were afraid. The gospel has stopped. So it seems to be very much a cliffhanger. There has to be something else. Well, shorter ending, and they all had commanded them, told briefly to those around. Peter, afterwards, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west, sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. But notice you got this longer ending where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, appears to his disciples, and he commissions his disciples. Then he ascends. So, and again, you get the footnote right there at the end of those little brackets. There's this ending is possibly extra. The longer ending, it's absent in some of the oldest copies again of Mark. Sinaiticus, which is a Greek copy, and also another manuscript. And the earliest church fathers, Clement of Alexandria and Origen, these church preachers who would quote and copy down passages, they don't mention this. There's an awkward connection between verses 8 and 9 that have led most scholars to conclude that the long ending of Mark was not a part of the original gospel. Now, the shorter ending, some of the manuscripts preserve the so-called shorter ending. Almost all that do also contain the longer ending. Okay. The shorter ending, 2, has no compelling claim to authenticity, for it contains a high percentage of non-Markan vocabulary and exhibits a rhetorical tone found nowhere else in the Gospel of Mark. So both these endings, the shorter and the longer, seem to be tacked on. They're secondary. They testify to a widespread belief that Mark's narrative did not abruptly conclude with frightened, silent women at the tomb, that they're unwilling to go out by this mysterious young man, or to share the words of this mysterious young man. These endings wish to confirm that the resurrection of Jesus, and at the same time underscore the missionary directive. It seems to be a cliffhanger if it ends at the end of verse, right there, what part of verse 8 there, where they were afraid. Yeah, I mean, it seems weird. It's a conundrum, but like I say, it's not in the earliest manuscripts, and it's a bit of a mystery. So that's why you see those footnotes if you have your NRSV or you have like an NIV. Of course, King James, I don't think has any notes on that. But there's something. Again, it's one of those things. When I get to heaven, if I still care at that point, I may ask God and say, "Hey, what's the deal?" And He'll probably laugh and say, "Well, whatever. It's no big deal." But anyway, thanks, guys. That's the Gospel of Mark.